Now, without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Robert P. Jones in celebration of his book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. In this book, Jones shows how the enslavement of Africans was not America's original sin, but rather the continuation of acts of genocide and dispossession flowing from the first European contact with Native Americans. The reframing that Jones conducts of the American origin story explains how the founders of the United States could build the philosophical framework for a democratic society on the foundation of mass racial violence, and why this paradox survives today in the form of white Christian nationalism. Jones is the president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute and a leading scholar and commentator on religion and politics. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic, Time, the Religion News, and the Religion News Service. He is the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, and The End of White Christian America. He writes a regular Substack newsletter at robertjjones.substack.com. Jones will be in conversation with Wajahat Ali, a New York Times contributing op-ed writer, public speaker, recovering attorney, and dad of 3 cute kids. His work has appeared in The Atlantic, Washington Post, Guardian, and New York Review of Books. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful guests.
Hello, hello, hello. How's everyone doing? Thank you for joining us to discuss white supremacy on a Thursday night. We have assembled, I'm assuming, a crowd of masochists. So thank you for joining us and welcoming Dr. Robbie Jones with his New York Times bestselling, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, that all of you shall buy, correct? All right. Someone's phone? Bueller? All right, it's all good. So I can ask the first question of why you wrote this book, but I'm going to ask it in a different way because I enjoy superhero origin stories. I'm going to ask it this way. Robbie Jones, as a good, nice white boy who grew up in the South, as a Baptist, who knew the hymns, why would you write against white Christian nationalism, which has been so good to you and your people? Why would you turn Benedict Arnold against an ideology and a movement that has only helped you? Explain this to me.
This is why, I'm glad you're here. Kind of get us off on the right foot here. So first of all, thank you for being here and for your time. Wajahat and I go back a ways, admire of his writing and work, and his humor, I'll have to say, as well. So he'll keep it lively tonight and keep me from droning on. So I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. Just a little bit of background. As a Southern Baptist, I was that kid who was at church like literally 5 times a week. I know for those of you maybe not from the South, that sounds a little exaggerated. It's not hyperbole. It's true. Thursday and Friday were kind of Sabbaths from church, but the rest we were there. And I went to public schools in Jackson public school system, but then I went to a Southern Baptist college. I went to a Southern Baptist seminary. I have a seminary degree from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, and then did PhD work at Emory University. So all in the South. I did make my way to Methodist by the time I got to Emory there, but it's been kind of a lifelong journey for me. And I would say that like growing up inside that world, there was so much that was, just rendered invisible, right? About our past. Like one just very obvious thing is that I never knew growing up what the word Southern in Southern Baptist really meant, right? So Southern Baptists still exist today. In fact, they are the largest expression of Protestant Christianity in the country with 13 million members still today. But I never was taught anything. I thought it was just a kind of compass point, a geographic, we're down here, the American Baptists are up there. And it wasn't until I got to seminary that I finally had a professor tell me that what Southern really means is that the break was over slavery. Right, and it was 1845 when they broke with their northern brethren over the issue of slavery. So the genesis story of the largest Protestant Christian denomination in the country and my home denomination, is that it was a place to make enslaving others on the basis of the color of their skin compatible with the Christian gospel. Like, that's the straightforward way to saying it. But I didn't get that, right, until I was, and at that point, it really did, it was not a kind of one thing where everything, the scales fell from my eyes. There wasn't that kind of experience, but it was just a crack in the edifice, right? Some light became kind of streaming in, and it has just taken me a painfully long time, right, to kind of peck my way out of that and to kind of get a broader perspective, keep widening the aperture. And so really, the last three books all have the word white in them, right? They're all me wrestling in various ways with that world, and the world that is still so powerful, I think, in American politics and culture, and trying to make sense of it. And for me, it's from the inside out. So I've got this kind of inside experience, but I also have academic training that kind of gives me some critical leverage on it. And that's really what I've been up to.
Speaking about the inside perspective, you were just mentioning backstage, which is not really a stage. It's just a room right there. I mean, they just make us look, kind of fancy, right? So they could separate us from the commoners, the proletariat. And so we just go there and mill around, and they give us some water, and then we come back out here. But when we were backstage, you mentioned to me that when you were growing up, as you can tell, Robbie is a massive nerd. He was a valedictorian of high school, right? You grew up academic, and you told me that as a valedictorian, you were not taught, and you did not really know Medgar Evans, even though you're from Mississippi, and you barely knew Emmett Till. All right. And so before we get into the book, because I'm looking at the title of the book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, people of color are like, what are you talking about, hidden roots of white supremacy? Like, talk to indigenous people, completely destroyed. Talk to black people who are enslaved. There's nothing hidden, Robbie. It's like, like white people have discovered racism. Great. But I think sometimes people forget that we all have our blinders on, right? So take us to the South in Mississippi, where a precocious kid like you, who was a valedictorian, if I go and ask you, hey, tell me about Emmett Till and Medgar Evans, You're like, who's that?
Yeah.
How does that happen?
It's stunning. So I went to public school in Jackson, Mississippi. Did really well, and I graduated with all of the knowledge that the state of Mississippi thought I needed to go out into the world, right? And it did not include, Medgar Evers was gunned down 9 miles from my driveway in Jackson, Mississippi, right? 9 miles from where I lived. Now, before that was 1963. I was born in 68, so it was, before my time, but not that far before my time. And I knew absolutely nothing about that story. Never made it into Emmett Till. I think I knew the name, but if you'd asked me to tell anything about the story, what happened, what was its relationship to the civil rights movement, I couldn't have connected any of those dots. Again, it was just not taught. So I think, again, in some ways, it's trying to kind of make these connections. And goodness knows, if you'd asked me to say anything about the Choctaw, the Chickasaw in Mississippi, I would have looked at you. Well, they were some Paleolithic, group that left some arrowheads, that we find from time to time when we till up the ground. I mean, that's literally what I would have had to say. But the connection between genocide, forced removal, the Trail of Tears, and indigenous people, and the importation of Africans to work that land that they were then forced off of, like that connection, that one story.
Your land,
right?
specifically. Mississippi.
Yeah, right. That's all in the state of Mississippi, right? Was completely lost on me.
And what's so interesting is you fast forward, and I hope you don't mind me sharing, when you were researching this book, I forget where we were, it was like a year and a half ago. And as you were writing it, you're like, man, after all these years, I find out new stuff, like the Doctrine of Discovery. And I remember when you were telling me about this, you were just like you did your LinkedIn profile. You're like, I have a master's, I went to Emory, I'm a Baptist kid, I'm a researcher. And at this stage, I'm discovering the Doctrine of Discovery, and this DeLorean needs to go beyond 1619. So talk to us about why 1619 is not necessarily the starting point and goes back to 15th century. It goes back to Spain, and specifically why we should look at the Doctrine of Discovery to understand why we are inheriting the very same problems that you've discussed in the 20th century in Mississippi.
Well, I'll start with 1776, right? The sort of bicentennial year. That happened when I was in elementary school as well. And in fact, that, just to kind of weave all this stuff together, the year that we were celebrating the bicentennial was the year that Jackson Public School System finally got around to integrating, right? So I experienced that. Like, it was like my class, right, that had that, and nobody talked about it. Not our churches, not our parents, not no one. So we had this kind of sea change in our everyday social world. We had our first African-American teachers, our first African-American classmates. No one gives us
just for people who are bad at math. That's 1970s.
1976.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Just
Yes.
let you know. All right.
Yes. Right. So 22 years after Brown v. Board of Education, right? We're really dragging our feet, right, in Mississippi here. And again, it's just this utter silence about what's really going on. But that's not what you asked me about. I went on a little digression there. So 1776, right? And we've had, just in the last 4 or 5 years, this big cultural national argument. Is it 1619? Is it 1776, right? The 1619 Project, the book's out there. I saw it on the table, still selling very well. But it was a challenge, right, to that story. And part of it is, this idea of like our in the beginnings, right, determine the rest of the story. And so if our in the beginnings are, those white dudes and their colonial finery and their quill pens all awkwardly posed around that table in Philadelphia in 1776, we don't have a lot to account for other than those guys declaring their independence from a colonial power in Great Britain. But when the 1619 Project said, if you remember the New York Times, when it published that, it was a very different image. And the image was a vast ocean, right? It was a kind of ominous picture. It was dark, it was gray, it was kind of monochromatic, right? And it's an image of that and one ship, right? And it's not the Mayflower, right? It is the ship that's bringing over people who had been kidnapped from their homes and destined for enslavement in the British colonies. So if that's our in the beginning, well, we have to account for a very different set of circumstances in whatever story we tell, if that's the place we begin it. So I think that was like the huge, Herculean work that the 1619 Project did. But as I began digging into it, I realized like, okay, well, yeah, that's really important that we've dislodged this kind of, narrow lens on 1776. But even at 1619, we have more than a century of European contact with indigenous people on these lands, right? And so if we're really going to tell the broader story, we've got to take the aperture back even more. And in the book, I arguing that we got to take it at least back to 1493, not 2. We're not 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as I was taught in elementary school.
And discovered America.
Yeah, right. That's right. And discovered America.
Brought civilization.
Even though he never set foot here. Yes. But 1493, because what happens, that's the year he goes back. Right. And he goes back and he wants more soldiers, more missionaries, and more provisions and money. But the other thing that he really needs is he wants a specific moral mandate for what he's about to do. Right. And as people have been doing all across the late 1400s, right, as they've encountered different lands, Spain and Portugal have wanted a moral mandate. And who do they turn to? They turn to the Christian church to give them this moral mandate. And the question is, what do we do with these people that are on lands we didn't know existed? What's our responsibility toward them? What rights do they have that we are bound to respect? Over a period of time, this body of work that comes straight out of the Vatican comes to be known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And it's a set of theological documents papal bulls setting out. But the logic of it, even though they're fairly sophisticated and a lot of Latin and all that, the logic of it is fairly straightforward. And essentially, it starts with this one question. Are they Christian? Are those people you're encountering Christian? And if the answer is no, they are to be considered enemies of Christ. That's the language, right, in the document. So this kind of bellicose language right from the start. And then it just goes on to spell out, right? And as such, you have the right to occupy their land, to take their goods. And if they resist, you have the right to kill them. And it even spells out, in this kind of very specific language, and you have the right to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Right? That's in the documents coming, out of the Vatican. And lest any of you Protestants out there are starting to point the fingers at Catholics and go, yeah, the Catholics. This is before the Protestant Reformation, right? There's no Protestants in the world. Any of you Anglicans who are getting too smug out there, right, are Episcopalians. This is before the break with the Church of England, all right? So all of Western Christendom is looking to the Pope, right, for a moral authority. And that's really, we think about all this navigation, but there's a moral compass that gets set. And that's the moral compass that gets set, that attitude, and it is the superiority of the European race and the superiority of Christianity. That Christianity and civilization, you see that word over and over and over again as justification for the whole entire colonial project.
I mean, that's a powerful rationalization, right? Like your imperialism has a celestial stamp of approval. So if God, the omniscient deity, has given me permission to go forth, I'm not committing rape and genocide. I'm merely purifying the land.
Right. And the idea was that these two things, that the gifts of Christianity and the gift of civilization were so weighty that whatever people lost didn't add up. If you put them on a scale, Christianity and civilization outweighed freedom, outweighed livelihood, outweighed goods, outweighed land. Right. In fact, they were coming out ahead because we had given them Christianity and civilization.
So you say that, and as soon as you're saying that, I'm thinking white Christian nationalism. I'm thinking MAGA. I'm thinking 2023. And for those of you out there who aren't nerds like me and Robbie and have spent time researching white Christian nationalism or come from religious communities, so many Americans I don't understand. In 2023, there are these people that we know that love God, love Jesus, go to church, and love a 4-time indicted, vulgarian who can no longer do business in New York and has 91 criminal counts, and they see him as the Redeemer and the Avatar, and Jesus apparently will be resurrected with an AR-15. How do you reconcile? I'm not making that up, by the way. You think I'm joking, but that's the exact words of William Boykin, General Boykin, a white Christian nationalist, who said Jesus will be resurrected and he'll be carrying an AR-15. Warrior Jesus. So for those, and so many are like, I don't understand. Like, don't they know? Don't they read the Bible? And yet this is now a movement, this white Christian nationalist movement, as you know, that is part and parcel of the modern Republican Party. How do you explain that, the fusion of religion and politics with the white Christian nationalist movement that, to me, seems to date back all the way to what you're saying is 1493?
Yeah. Well, I think we could ask these mystifying questions at various points in American history, right? We can go back. How do we have the spate of the bloodshed in the 1920s, the spate of lynchings that we had in Red Summer? That's largely, most of those no one brought to prosecution, just happens. How do we have a civil war that spills blood over defending slavery, right? And I think if we understand that, again, this version of Christianity that has the superiority of Europeans and Christianity over everyone else in the world, if we take that seriously, I think it makes a lot more sense, right? Because again, it is a divine chosenness, right, that really is at the heart of this, that really can justify almost anything at the end of the day. And what it's most about doing is defending the place of white Christian people on the top of the social and political heap, really. And so these movements kind of come forward. Like, it's worth remembering the KKK, right, was a Protestant Christian organization, right? We think of it as just being this kind of, anti-black organization, but, they were against and terrorized Jews and Catholics, right? So how does that make sense? Well, it's because the positive vision was exactly this, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christian America that they were out defending. And so anyone who didn't fit that, right, was a threat to America, to that concept of America. So I think this old idea, if you really boil it down, this very old idea, we've had this kind of competing. It's competing even in our founding documents, right? The Declaration of Independence has these great philosophical principles, but it also has the words "merciless savages," referring to indigenous people, like in the document of the Declaration of Independence. So this idea, like, are we a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians? Is that who this country is? Or are we a pluralistic democracy, right? And these are like, these strains go all the way down, and they are competing even in our founding documents, right? It's not just like, here's our documents and here's this other ideology. They're shot through with this. And so I think if we take that seriously, we are still fighting out the answer to that question, right? Because that's the version of Christianity that landed on the shores, and it's the one that we've never fully said no to.
Before we go back in the DeLorean and connect the dots, especially as books are being banned in the United States of America, a record number of books, and specifically history and AP history and AP psychology, in some states that won't be named but might rhyme with Florida. Excuse me, there was something caught in my throat. What you said about this type of this battle, right? Yeah. And folks who are basically saying, well, if it's between my vision of an America where my people get to be on top as divinely ordained by God, or freedom and liberty and pluralism, I'll let that go. You've done the polls, PRRI, right? Yeah. Looking at the numbers right now, how much of our country is in the camp of, if it's between pluralism and democracy and a white Christian nationalist America, I'm all in with white Christian nationalist America.
Well, for those of you who aren't data nerds, you'll be happy to know there's actually only 2 charts in the book, which is a record for me. There are only 2 charts in the book because my day job is looking at little percent signs most of the day. So we asked earlier this year, we did a big survey with the Brookings Institution, and we had some measures of like who's in. And one of the questions we did, I specifically, we worded so that it would match the Doctrine of Discovery, the central assertion of the Doctrine of Discovery. And basically just says, do you agree or disagree that the U.S. was ordained by God to be a promised land for European Christians? Do you agree or disagree with that statement? So it turns out that 30% of the country agrees with that statement. Now, so you can look at that a couple of ways. 2/3 of the country rejects that statement, right? But 30% of the country agrees with that statement. And one of the reasons why it is so front and center in our politics is because that 30% isn't evenly spread across the country. In fact, if you look at, there's 2 groups where a majority, 2 major kind of demographic groups where a majority agrees with that. One of them are my people, white evangelical Protestant Christians. A majority of white evangelicals agree with that statement. The other one...
How much, if you have the numbers?
It's 54%.
Got it.
And the other one is self-identified Republicans. So 56% of self-identified Republicans agree with that old idea, right, that this is a chosen land for European... Even when we put like European Christians in the question, that's where we're at. So I think even though it's a 2/3, 1/3 divide in the country, because it loads this way in our partisan divides, it is front and center, right, in the way the 2 parties are actually defining themselves now. I mean, it's notable to me that the Republican Party actually abandoned having a party platform, right, under Trump, right? Just didn't even construct one. Like, that's historic, right, in modern politics, that they wouldn't even bother because they knew as soon as they did, Trump would sort of like disagree with it.
It was the 2020 RNC. They had no platform.
Yeah, no platform at all. But, basis we're with that guy, right? And I still think, with the you mentioned MAGA, the most powerful piece of that Make America Great Again piece is the again, right? It's that last thing, hearkening back, this nostalgia for this previous time, right? When white Christians were kind of at the center.
A romanticized version of the past. Yeah. It's I don't know if anyone's seen it, Birth of a Nation, but I feel like it's one of those movies that, like, if you really want to understand America, just see Birth of a Nation and you see all the fears and frustrations and the romanticized vision come forward in that movie, which, by the way, was screened in the White House. Yeah. Woodrow Wilson loved it. And that movie, showing the power of pop culture, helped influence the rise of the KKK again in the South. But I digress.
It was also screened in Tulsa after the Tulsa Race Massacre.
And you know what? This is why we're a good team, because I was going there. Yeah. And so you're talking about these narratives, right? So we're seeing record book bans right now. We're seeing the type of hysterical freakout over 1619 that you think should be reserved for, a pandemic that killed 1 million people. Too soon? You see, the attacks on CRT. You see the aggressive attempt to ban books, especially by women of color, Toni Morrison, right? And once you say this, and you kind of connect the dots, you're like, oh yeah, because this vision of American history that fills in the missing pages is so contradictory and challenging to the pristine narrative that says that this country belongs to us and we purified it and we're the civilizational anchor to savagery, which then takes me back to Tulsa, right? Because I want you, if you can, for those who don't know, explain what happened in 1921. And then after explaining it, try to explain to us as a historian, how come I did not hear about it until like 3 years ago? If you can make those connections. Sure. I'm asking a big ask for you, sir.
So it's probably the one event like this that most people have heard about, if they've heard about any of them, because 2021 was the centennial recognition and memorialization of these events. And so just in a nutshell, there was a young white girl, she was 16, who accused a 19-year-old who was working in a shoe shine stand of sexually assaulting her in an elevator, right? Turns out there was not enough evidence to even move forward with it by the police, but rumors started flying. The newspaper started printing these salacious events of what, Negro assaults, girl in elevator, and incites this huge riot. It turns into a multiple day, 2-day conflagration. And what essentially happened was there was a 2-day killing spree of upwards of 300 African Americans by their roving bands of their white neighbors, right? Over 2 days. So think about that for a minute. Like, this is the thing that hit me when I think about that. This is not just like, most of the time we think about mob violence, it's like something gets out of control, a spark hits, the fire ignites. But in Tulsa, the white citizens of Tulsa went out, killed their black neighbors, came home, ate dinner, put their kids to bed, got a good night's sleep, woke up the next morning and went out and did it again, right? That's like, so had a chance to kind of cool off. Yeah. And again, it's one of the worst cases of mass racial violence in the country here. And, it's very soon swept under the rug. I actually found the sermon that was preached in one of the kind of most prominent churches in Tulsa the Sunday after this, and it's remarkable, right? That they actually brought the bishop up from Dallas, the Methodist Church, to kind of shape the story, and he blames it on the African American population in Tulsa. And in the sermon, the only thing he lays at the feet of white people in Tulsa, and this is a very wealthy church, is he said, perhaps we've not been strict enough with our domestic servants. We've allowed vice to kind of live among, and if we had just been stricter with the help, that we could have maybe prevented this. Like, that's the only thing he lays on the white citizens of Tulsa. It's a really remarkably awful sermon. And then that's the story, and that becomes the party line among the white citizens of Tulsa. It's very quickly swept.
It's their fault.
Their fault. And they did burn down the entire section of African American section of town, Greenwood, there, which was mostly like a middle class, thriving African American neighborhood. There was something that's called Black Wall Street.
Self-sustaining.
Yeah, right. So then there's this long period of forgetting, right? Intentional, willful amnesia, right? And that was the kind of common thread through all the kind of places that I looked at in the book: Minnesota, Mississippi, and Oklahoma there. And like one remarkable thing, just to get your question though, one of the kind of historians that worked on this story interviewed the head of the Tulsa Historical Society in the 80s, who denied that it happened.
Wow.
The head of the Historical Society, right, in Tulsa, said, "Oh yeah, that was not white people. It was what he literally said was it was Indians and Mexicans that did that. That's why they were responsible for the violence. It wasn't white people." And that's from the head of the Historical Society as late as the 80s, right? And so then there's been this process of truth telling that happens. The other layer, just as we're about to see, there's Killers of the Flower Moon, the movie is about to come out. Right.
A few miles.
Connect the dots here. A few miles and just a few years behind the Tulsa Race Massacre is what became known as the Reign of Terror among the Osage Indians there, who were terrorized because after getting pushed across into Oklahoma, first of all, they weren't native to the state, put on a reservation in Oklahoma, and then pushed off that land and put on what they thought was worthless kind of scrub brush land. Turns out there was oil on that land, and they become some of the wealthiest residents of the state of Oklahoma because they're sitting on this land and actually own the mineral rights to the land. And then there's just one more assault where people are actually stooping to things like marrying into Osage families and then killing their wives and children, right, to inherit the oil head rights.
Spoiler alert for the movie, but it's based on Killers of the Flower Moon, where we were talking about this backstage, where the depravity, like the depths of depravity, the way that they systematically poisoned and murdered and killed the indigenous people to take over their wealth, even through marriage, right? And there's a recurring thread here, if you see, that we would not have known about that unless that writer was able to tell that story.
Yeah.
And that book is now going to be made into a movie, which apparently is very good, that people are going to see in 1619 Project. But the power of story, the power of narratives, the power of speaking out, the power of reading the banned books, right? And an example where I want to ask you about this, because it's in the book also, and you mentioned that you didn't know, but people know, right? The murder of Emmett Till, and the fact that Emmett Till's mother made this amazing decision to have an open casket funeral, because she said, I want the world to see what happened. What was it about Emmett Till that was a disruption in the norm? And what I mean by that, as you mentioned in the book, I mean, violence was celebrated and normalized. People used to have picnics. They used to hang black bodies. No one cared. Why was that somewhat of a pivot point that has persisted and sustained within our consciousness?
Well, I think it was a lot of it. I mean, things that came together. It was a tinderbox at that time because it was right after Brown v. Board of Education, right? So in Mississippi, like, it was very, very tense. But what's notable too is, like, why is she in Chicago, right? She's in Chicago because she was part of the Great Migration from Mississippi. So why does he come back? Because he's got relatives in Mississippi, right? That he's visiting his uncle in Mississippi. So even the fact that she left, right, was because of violence and threats and discrimination there, and then sends her son back. But I think it was the violence of it, but I think also her decision, that courageous decision, and the fact that there were tens of thousands of people that turned up, right, to protest all over the country. Like, it did just spark something, and I think it was because it was this it was a teenage boy whistling at a white woman, like
allegedly whistling.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, one of his the people who accompanied him actually did say it happened. Yeah.
Okay.
But still, like.
But she lied, though, right? Didn't the
Yeah, but he never touched her. It was never. There was nothing like that. She said he did in the stand and all of that.
And then she years later said, "Oops, I lied."
Yeah.
And I think she died just this year, right?
She
in April?
died this year. Yeah. But I think 14-year-old boy, right? Murdered, tortured, and then the two men who did it were acquitted by an all white, all male jury in 67 minutes. Is how long they deliberated, at the trial. And it's one little fun fact. The reason why there were only white men in the jury is because there were 0 African Americans registered to vote. Mm. And you cannot be picked for a jury if you're not registered to vote. So there's not even the possibility of an African American being chosen for that jury, because white supremacy and voter suppression were so extreme that in a county that was half black, 0 African Americans are registered to vote right in there. So some
would say, not me, that it's caked into the system.
Yeah.
It might be systemic racism. Not me, though. I wouldn't say that. But speaking of racists, Carolyn Bryan Dunham, who lied and got this teenage boy killed. And speaking about white women in particular, don't worry, just go with me here. Author Elizabeth McRae wrote a book called Mothers of Massive Resistance, White Women and the Politics of White Supremacy, right? And she writes that white women in America have been, her quote, segregation's constant gardeners, end quote. A majority of white women voted for Trump in 2016. In 2020, a larger number voted for Donald Trump. A slim majority, but a majority nonetheless. And so when we're looking at the present moment, the book bans, the anti-CRT movements, Moms for Liberty, it's these suburban white women, right? And so the question I have, because you've done the research, why do white women in 2023 continue to side with an ideology of white supremacy that places them second and historically has been so detrimental to American progress?
Yeah, well, it's obviously a complex question. But, I think what we see is that, there was this great sense that when Hillary Clinton was a presidential candidate, that white women were going to flock to vote for Hillary Clinton. That obviously did not happen, right? And I think it was a real misreading of the power of white supremacy, right? And it's not, white women, even though it's a clear hierarchical system where men are over women, white people are over all non-white people, Christians are over all non-Christian people. It is this very hierarchical worldview that, again, is very old. But as being in that white Christian upper tier, despite the fact that they're one rung below men, they benefit greatly, right? White women benefit from that system. And so I think that's pretty much the straightforward answer. But, the formula for getting lynched as a person of color in this country was essentially having a white woman accuse you of sexual assault. Like, that is if you go to the Memorial for Peace and Healing in Montgomery, and they have all these things, here's the reason why this person was lynched, the alleged reason. It is all, I don't know like what the percentage is, but it is overwhelming. You just see this over and over, accused of raping a white woman, accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. Like that's the reason over and over and over again.
Yeah, so the Karen meme that I know people don't like, the weaponization of whiteness and white tears, this is like a through line in U.S. history. Not all white women. Some of our best friends are white women. We love white women. My favorite white woman is a moderate white woman. It's just a thank you, white women, for coming to this. I just had to say that out loud to protect Robbie and myself. But it's a constant threat that we're witnessing, right? And speaking about the present moment, we talk about Tulsa, and oftentimes it's very comforting to be like, oh, back in the days, Tulsa, Emmett Till, 1960s. But you know what? We voted for Obama once. And my mom loves the Beyonce, and I dated an Asian in college. And we live in a post-racial society, and I'm sure you heard Tim Scott yesterday. Did you hear Tim Scott? Oh, that was just sad to hear. It was like, Tim Scott was like, in our people, I was trying to do my Tim Scott impression, but I can't. But he's like, black people have, survived and endured racism, and it's a testament to our strength. And what was really bad was the Great Society and President Johnson giving out these handouts and checks to the black man. That's what made us weak. And you're sitting there like, bro, is it worth it? Is it worth it?
Harder to survive than slavery.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard.
There's a huge clip. You think I'd make this up? Can't even make this up. So here we are in the 21st century where, like you said, white supremacy, it's not just white men. It beguiles and entices white women. Tim Scott's, Muslims in the suburbs now, like South Asians, right? It's persistent. And I want to talk about the stakes here for a second, because no one talks about the stakes. If we let white Christian nationalism in its modern form go unchecked and unchallenged, what are we looking at, Robbie?
Well, the end of the book, I do kind of come back and say, I won't spoil it, but the end of the book the last section is called Confession and Call, a Word to My Fellow White Christians, where I kind of lay out basically, a version of this thing. And I think the thing that I think many, people who look like me, who have this, are Christian, who have this background, we have often thought that it's an altruistic move for us to get behind movements for racial justice. Right? It's something we're doing for somebody else, kind of thing. And yeah, we're going to make things right. And yes, we've got to balance the ledgers. But I think what we have failed to see is what we have at stake, right? What we have at stake. The line from James Baldwin has been like a huge influence on my thinking. He was asked one time what black people think about white people, right? And particularly why there's not more black violence on a daily basis toward white people, given this awful history. And he said, well, we do know white people pretty well. We've lived intimately with them. Yeah. And the way he put it, he said, we perhaps know about white people what a mother knows about her child. And then he said, many of us have come to see white Americans as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. Right? The slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. And that has really stayed with me. So when you see today, like, I think the desperate, like outlandish moves and mental gymnastics that many white Christians are willing to do to get behind Trump, right? With all the things you said.
I would add violent and undemocratic.
Yeah, violent, undemocratic, QAnon, denying COVID. Like, these are all things, we are not well. right? I think is the best way to say it, right?
The lady in front said, "Stupid."
Yeah,
and I'm like,
right.
well,
No, the
Cliff Notes.
But when you take that, like the slightly mad victims of our own brainwashing, because we have believed this impossibly naive and innocent story that we have insisted that everybody affirm, right? That, and we've invented a whole vocabulary, right? That kind of covers it up, right? Pioneer. Like in Bethesda, there's a statue, if you've seen it, to the pioneering woman over in Bethesda. It's still today, right on Wisconsin, not far from here. But what is that, right? It's a violent colonizer, right? That's what a pioneer is in this context. So we just have all these euphemisms that we've used to cover up, I think, the really challenging story. And we like to say we're all heroes. We were all always acted virtuously. We were always kind to immigrants and generous to the Indians, right? That's the story we want to tell.
We invited them to Thanksgiving, and
yeah, right. That's
corn.
right. And that's a version of
we gave them the plague.
Right. But I think what it's done is it's meant that we've hidden the truth from ourselves, right? And no people can be healthy living out of a lie. And I think that's really the crossroads that we're at.
So you took it spiritual, but I think just to your point of how white supremacy is ultimately self-destructive for white people, I know you're familiar with Jonathan Metzl's book, Dying of Whiteness, where he went throughout the South and he did the numbers and he said, people always say, well, why are they voting against their own interests? He goes, no, they're voting for white supremacy. But he literally talked to people and they're like, will you support Obamacare even though it'll save your life? They're like, over my dead body, that person died. Gun rights are killing white men. The proliferation of guns in Tennessee has led to white male suicides. They don't care. Ultimately, can you make that case that your investment in white supremacy is literally, according to all the data, shortening the lifespan of white people by like 6 to 7 years? Is that enough, or are we looking at a 30% death cult? Because a part of me, and we've talked about this before, is I've always given the numbers. I remember you weren't shocked by me. Like I said, I think we've lost 30% of this country in my lifetime. That's what I've said. They live on Earth 3, QAnon, replacement theory, anti-vax. And a part of me is like, how do you win over 30% that is committed not only to self-immolation, but if they can't be on top, they're going to burn it all down, including me. Your response to that 30%, how do you win them over? Or can you even?
Yeah. I don't have a 10-point plan.
No, I know.
At the end of the book. If I did,
your degrees have failed you.
That's right. Yeah. So here's what I hope. So one of the things I did in the book is I spent a lot of time on the ground talking to people working on these issues at the local level. And not in easy places like the Mississippi Delta, right? Impoverished, politically divided, racially divided, very conservative. Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? Oklahoma has the distinction of being the state in which every county voted for Trump. It's the only state, I think, in which every single county voted for Trump. So very conservative place, right? And yet these people on the ground found ways to work in their local community. In Tallahatchie County, these are, again, it's rural, so it's a small place. These are descendants of enslaved people and sharecroppers working together with descendants of enslavers. Right. And they know what your great granddaddy did to my great granddaddy. Right. Because we're all still here. That's the kind of community it is. And yet they found a way to kind of try to tell the truth. And when I talk to them, they're all like, we're not going to get past this. Right. These divisions, this rift, this dishonesty. We have to kind of be honest with it to build any kind of foundation so that our kids and our kids' kids can do something different. So I don't have a formula up here. But if I'm asking where I find hope, I think it is looking at the lives of those folks that are working down at the local level without many resources, by the way. And that little group, it was like a dozen people meeting in a room, right, in Tallahatchie County, succeeded in just this past summer, after 20 years of work, in getting a new national monument signed off by President Biden. Just signed off on it in August. It's going to be the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley national monument. But that happened not because Biden had a great idea. That happened because these people on the ground have been working for 20 years to bring that to fruition, and to kind of mark local things at their local level and bring it up to the national level. And I just can't resist quoting Kamala Harris. I was at the event, at the reception at the Department of Interior after the signing of the law, and she spoke and she said, speaks into the bigger conversation we're having. What she said, I was really moving. She said, let us not be tempted or seduced. Let us not be seduced into thinking we will be better if we forget. We will be better if we remember. We will be stronger if we remember. And I think that is kind of at the heart of, like, if something's going to change, it's not going to be up here. I think it's going to be, 1,000 flowers blooming down here. One more real quick one. In D.C., just this past weekend, to tell you how local this is, many of you may have seen it, what happened at the Washington National Cathedral just this weekend. Right? Any heads nodding? Yeah. Finally replaced the windows that were put there in the 1950s by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And those windows had Confederate flags in them and celebrated Jackson, Lee, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis, right? And they sat in our big cathedral
2023
in D.C. Yeah, they were removed a few years ago, but only like 5 years ago were they removed, and they've just now been replaced. That's how, at the beginning of this process, I think, of truth telling that we really are.
You're a pro, and you've been here before, because before I was gonna even open it up, you're like 7:45. I'm just gonna mosey on up. Yeah. So you get the first crack. Well done, sir. Very impressive.
Well, thank you very much for that fond introduction. We're clearly seeing an upsurge in action to promote the white evangelical Christian agenda that you have so brilliantly explained to us. What do you think the catalyst or catalysts have been for this sudden upsurge in action on book bans, on breaking down affirmative action, all the steps? There seems to have been a sudden acceleration or even a shift of direction in the country whereby we've turned away, or parts of the country have turned away from what we would consider progress on these issues, and turned back in a retro direction. What do you think is what has catalyzed that?
You all heard that, right? Okay.
Yeah. So I think I would characterize it as a kind of last stand by a desperate people. Kind of death rattle, right? For people at the kind of terminal. Actually, in the last book, I used this analogy, the kind of stages of grief analogy at the end, right? Kind of, so when we get this kind of terminal diagnosis of a kind of world that we thought we'd hang on to forever, we go through these stages, right? Denial, anger, right? And we might get to acceptance over here, but we might not. That's the kind of over at the end. But I think we're pretty much in the denial and anger stage, right? Of reacting, and the kind of terminal diagnosis to that worldview, you can see it in the numbers. So I gave you the numbers of, we're 42% white and Christian in the country today, down from a majority just at the beginning of Barack Obama's stance. But if you look at white evangelical Protestants, right, the group that's the most vocal that you're talking about, that kind of has become really doubled down here with the MAGA movement, that they have lost more members in the last 10 to 20 years than any other group that we measure on public opinion surveys. So just 20 years ago, they were white evangelicals by themselves were about a quarter of the U.S. population. Today, they are 13.6, right? Their median age is now 56, right? The median age of the country is in the mid-40s, right? So they're aging and shrinking. And so there's a way in which I think the writing is on the wall, and there is this move. While we still have some leverage, this is a kind of a last stand, I think, kind of movement.
Sir.
Good evening. My name is Jesse Fenty. I'm a local Washingtonian IP attorney. I think we need a movement in the U.S., which is probably impossible, and definitely maybe in D.C., maybe here at Politics and Prose. We got to stop using this term white. I think if you look as I look around the room, I've been doing this recently. There's no white people in here. There's pink people. There's cream people, there's pale people, there's olive colored people. There's no, excuse me. Yeah, I don't see any white people. Are you okay? All right. And if there were a lot of black people here, they're not black either. They're brown, they're light brown, they're mocha, they're caramel, they're cap. So if you live in a society where you have all these different shades of people, but they get broken down into two colors of people, that's 1984. That's totalitarianism. That's authoritarianism. That's 2 + 2 = 5. And we've been living in a society for so long, like you said, white too long, that we just need to change the definitions of these things that we've been using for so long. I mean, you talk about the Doctrine of Discovery, I take it back to 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. You had a room like this of people who burned down Jamestown, and the elite said, we can't have that. You Africans are now black, you Europeans are now white, and you white people are over the black people. So it was a white bribe in 1676, and it's still a white bribe. Europeans are bribed into being white, into accepting the spoils of war. So we need to. So one question is: will you redefine yourself? Call yourself, if you're not gonna call yourself pink, call yourself a German, English, American. Call yourself an Estonian. In your book, you talk about in Duluth, those two guys who were buried in the church. You said they were buried in a Norwegian Lutheran church. Fantastic. I can identify with that. If you said they were buried in a white church, I don't know what that means. So the white part is the first part. Then the Christian part, anybody who knows Christian history, this thing goes back 10,000 years. Jesus was not born 2,000 years ago. This is Osiris. This is Horus. This is Zoroaster. This is Mithras. This is the sun on December 25th being reborn, the actual sun.
I got people behind you, but so
my question is,
will he choose to be Mr. Pink?
Yes.
Instead of white, is there another category of white? And then you said a second question.
The second question is, if you want to be a Christian, will you admit that Christianity existed before Christ?
All right. So
All right, yeah.
Go for it.
So, you know, what I do sometimes say
someone behind
is that I think of myself as someone who grew up thinking of myself as white. And I think that's really important. It's important for how it shaped my identity, for how I saw the world. And so I think, you know, obviously you're correct. Like all the, you know, everyone from genetics, right, tells us like race is a complete construction, social construction, no basis in biology. That is all right. Would it be better, I think, if we could sort of like dispense with it? I think it would. But I think in order to like understand the history that we've been dealt, I'm really wanting to hold that concept, the concept of whiteness, up to the light, right? And to say like, this is what it is. And part of it is recognize its constructedness. And, you know, so what I would say is, you know, if I've done some genealogical work, you know, I'm mostly like British and Scottish. Like that's what I am, right? And Baldwin was like great about this. Like, yeah, you know, people, it's all the Germans and the British and the everyone, you know, got here and became white when they got to America, right? That's clearly true.
And we can talk about
Yeah.
history more in a bit. We can talk about history better if we talk about that history versus white history. White is nebulous. It doesn't mean anything.
But white supremacy is real. That's the tricky part about this, is that white supremacy is a real social and cultural force that has shaped this country. I think that's one thing.
Get them afterwards.
Yeah.
Let me. Okay, so let's do this. We got 4 people. We have 6 minutes. Let's ask question. Let's do 2 questions.
Hey, Robbie. Quick question. I was curious, the very early part of your talk, you said that 30% of the country believes in the Doctrine of Discovery. And I was expecting you to then say, and that represents 60% of the Republican Party. And you said instead it represents 56%. So there's some percentage of the 30% that do not identify as Republican. Who are they? How do they identify?
All right, wait, and then let's do a second question.
Of all the different degrees that you have, one of them is a law degree. And how does that, he has a law degree.
Licensed, still licensed.
Uh-huh. Well,
Seminary law.
right. Do you think your seminary degree or your PhD or other degrees play more of a role in sorting these issues out?
All right, go for it.
Thank you for that question. It's really interesting. I think I may be the only person in D.C. that has a seminary degree and sometimes called a pollster. in the DC circle. So yeah, so basically I'm trained in social science and theology, right? I also have a math degree as an undergrad, but I've been able to kind of bring all that to bear. I think so. Part of being able to, one lens that I see things through is through social scientists and quantitative social science. So kind of thinking about 30% of this group, 56% of that group. What does that mean? How do we understand that? But it's been really helpful, I think, to not only have kind of the insider knowledge of growing up inside of a white evangelical church and having that theological training inside that world, because I think, it helps me make sense, I think, in many ways of what the numbers show. It gives me kind of I think, an extra perspective.
And it gives you a story behind the
story.
numbers.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
the gentleman's question about the Republicans.
Oh, right. So it's I forget the number of Democrats. I've got the chart. I can probably pull it out in a minute. I won't look it up right now. But it's very few Democrats. It's a few more independents. But it is 54, and then it drops off. It's the classic case of what social scientists say as asymmetrical polarization. That is yes, we're polarized on this, but it's not even, right? It's not Democrats here, independents here. It's not stair steps and Democrats here. It's Republicans here, independents here, and Democrats here.
That's why I hate the term polarization.
Yeah, it's not even.
We're all polarized. I'm like, hey, are we? All right, 2 questions real quick. We have 3 minutes. We'll get it done.
Dr. Jones, I just want to ask you.
Look at that. That's respect from the youth.
Yeah. This is my son.
Oh, that's why. That's a plan.
Sneaking up here.
That's a
I'm
plan.
a little worried about this. All right, go ahead.
Okay. So going way back in the conversation to the doctrine of discovery.
Yep.
Do you think that the conflict in the Church of England,
Yep.
right, and these separatists that were voluntarily so, but sort of sent to America, do you think they had a different idea of this doctrine of discovery? Because I think it's so broad that I feel like different groups, especially those who opposed the Church of England, might have a different definition
Great.
of that.
Thanks.
Oh, good question. And we got you. You got to follow it up.
That's a tough one to follow up. So one thing you didn't mention is studying physics. And I'm wondering, with the physics of social media, it's great that you have these individual groups, but how do you battle the physics of social media, which is spreading this message to Christians and non-Christians and spreading it around the world, and they're finding each other.
Solid follow-up.
Yeah.
Good saving face.
All right. Do you want to jump on one of these?
No. Go. You take it.
All right. Well, thank you.
Just for the time.
Thank you, Jasper, for the question. So the question, is about sort of the separatist groups from England. So it's true that the original Doctrine of Discovery, this was mostly Spain and Portugal, right? So, but England was not to be left out, right? So, and actually issued their own edict to John Cabot and his sons that essentially just ripped off the Doctrine of Discovery and stuck it in their own edict. So that one didn't actually come from the Pope, but it was modeled. It was model legislation, right, from the Vatican, and cut and paste job. Had all the same logic, and it had all the to occupy, to steal, to all of this stuff was, and just gave it to John Cabot and his sons rather than to Columbus and or Hernando De Soto and the other folks that had been addressed in the earlier papal bulls. And one little thing about John Winthrop here, who's known as this kind of city set on a hill, right, image that comes through. We still have presidents citing that. Reagan, right, famous for kind of using this imagery. But if you would ask Winthrop's indigenous neighbors about what that light coming out of that settlement meant to them, it was terror and violence, right? I think that's really worth remembering, is that it was a genocidal view, even from folks like John Winthrop, who could wax eloquently about Christian theology. So,
There's a social media question. Can we get those 2 in right before? Great. All right, the question of social media.
Yep.
You want to do it?
Oh, real quick. Wow, yes. So Ellen, where are you? Thank you for that very difficult question. I'm not sure I've got a great answer. You're right that the ability for these messages to travel, right, across, from Seattle to Mississippi in an instant, and I think particularly their ability to, this is what most of the research shows, their ability to kind of strive to raise emotions that are about grievance and anger and outrage, right? That's what moves social media like lightning. And they've showed like positive ones move like at 1/10 of the speed of something that evokes anger and outrage, right? I think I don't know. I mean, it is a real challenge here. And it is the way that I think a lot of these things are getting linked together, and particularly the Christian nationalist movement is getting stitched together, even when it's not kind of a cell of people who actually know each other right here, but they know each other out here. And it's a real challenge.
We'll do the final two questions, and thank you all for sticking around.
So you started with the personal experience of not learning any of this in middle school or high school. You are not writing for young audiences or youth audiences. How do we get these stories in front of youth groups and middle schools at a time when the decision makers are making that harder and harder?
Yeah.
And then let's do the last question.
Two concepts, power and economics.
Two concepts, power and economics.
Question. You say it starts in 1493. I say it starts in 1000 with the Crusades. And that the justification that was enunciated by the Vatican was an extension of what they were doing in the Crusades and before. And why were they doing it? Money and power. So when they come over here and we're talking about the establishment of the concept of white, as the gentleman said, it is a ridiculous concept, but it was a powerful one and it remains so. Underlying it, economics and power. And that's why, in my opinion, white people are willing to let wealthier, more powerful white people exploit them in order to remain white. Because if they weren't white, oh my God, what the hell happened to me? So what do you think?
So question about power economics going back to 1095 and Pope Urban II. Simple question. And then another one, which I think is related to the social media question, is how do you get this information to the young folks who are being radicalized, by the way, online?
Yeah. There's actually some really good online resources that a lot of classrooms. So the Zen History Project, that, is out of Howard Zen's People's History of the United States, is out there. There's also some good work by a friend of ours, Jamar Tisby, has got a book, How to Fight Racism, that has been put into kind of a young adult version as well. So there's some of those things that are out there. My son was just asking a question, so he's taking American history, as you can tell. But what's interesting is that they're actually pairing an AP American history textbook that, by the way, has the painting, the Spirit of 76 on the front of it, the three white dudes with the fife and the drum and the bandage around the head. That's on the front of the textbook, but they're pairing it with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Indigenous History of the United States, right? So they're pairing it. So I think it is happening, but there's also this backlash, right? In places where there is very intentionally not happening. And again, I think all of those things are it's like antibodies rushing to kill the thing that they know is going to overturn this impossible story that's been told. And so I think that's what I see, these attacks on CRT, book bans. They really are about just trying whatever they can do, right, to kind of stop this kind of fuller story from being told, because it does threaten economics, it does threaten social standing, all of those things. But I do think it's happening, and I see all these attacks as actually reactions to the progress and the winds that are blowing in a more progressive direction. And so the last one about here. So yeah, history. If there's anything I've learned, I'm actually more of a sociologist than historian. Is that it flows, right? We love to pick out dates, and even my 1619, 1493, 1776. Like we pick these dates because it gives us something for our brains to kind of latch onto. There's always these antecedents behind them, and I think you're right to point to the Crusades. Absolutely, the othering of Muslims and Jews as well. And the other thing, by the way, happens on the Iberian Peninsula in 1493 is the expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula during that same year by the same logic. By the way, and then before that is Constantine in 300. You could take it all the way back to the merger of Christianity and Roman Empire, where I think that the seeds of it at least are there. I landed on 1493 because I think I was looking for the closest proximate cause to our current troubles. I think that's, and I think you're right that river keeps flowing back. But I think there's something significant that crystallizes there. Again, not sui generis, but builds on, but kind of solidifies in a way that then gets carried into our cultural context.
Thank you, Politics and Prose, for hosting us. Thank you to Robbie
Thank you all.
Jones, Dr. Robbie Jones. The book is called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. And thank you all for a spirited conversation.